And what kind of performance can investors expect in terms of returns and, say, dividend policy?
Okay. Effectively, the returns of an ETF would be the weighted average returns of its underlying component stocks. So in this case, if the underlying stocks perform well, then the ETF will also perform well on the weighted average basis. But on the other hand, if the stocks come down, or the value starts to come off, then the ETF value will also come down. This is very much in line with the objective of an ETF, which I mentioned earlier, which is to replicate the performance of the index that is tracking. Yeah. In terms of dividends, an ETF can pay dividend. There are guidelines by the Securities Commission in terms of ability of an ETF to make income distribution, but generally an ETF can pay dividends to its unit holders.
What about risk factors, Izlan?
In terms of risk, I would say there are a few risks, just like any investment products. One is the risk of the underlying instruments that the ETF invests in. In this case, if we are talking about an equity-based ETF, then stock market risk is one risk of investing in equity ETF, because the underlying stocks will perform and be subject to volatility of the stock market, and so will the ETF value. A second risk would be liquidity risk, in the sense that a unit holder may or may not be able to buy or sell or transact in the ETF units, depending on the liquidity of the units on the stock exchange. This is similar to liquidity of a stock or single stock. If there is strong demand for the ETF units, then we can see a lot of liquidity. However, in certain periods where the demand tends to be a bit lower, then the liquidity will be quite thin. And I think if I could add, one other risk, which is quite specific to listed funds, is the premium or discount risk, in the sense that the price on the stock exchange for an ETF is actually a market price derived from supply and demand of units in the market. The actual value of the ETF is actually the NAV, or the net asset value. So there could be a slight discount or premium of the market price relative to the NAV of the fund. So this is another risk to investors.
Okay. Now, I understand that your ETF, the My ETF DJIM 25, is one of 3 ETFs currently traded on the Malaysian market. Can you tell us more about that?
Okay. My ETF is actually a Sharia-based ETF and Sharia equity-based ETF. It tracks the 25 leading Sharia-compliant stocks that are listed on Bursa Malaysia. The index that we are tracking is actually called Dow Jones Islamic Market Malaysia Titans 25 Index. It's quite a mouthful, so I call it DJIM 25 for short, representing the 25 leading Sharia-compliant stocks on Bursa. The fund was launched in January 2008, and it was actually called a national ETF by virtue of the fact that the idea for this ETF was actually mooted by our former Prime Minister in 2007 during one of the investment conferences. So i-VCAP has been identified to manage and launch this ETF, which we did in January 2008.
Can you share a little bit more about the index that it's tracking and how it's been doing so far?
The DJIM 25 index is provided by Dow Jones as the index provider. In terms of, because it is a Sharia compliant index, the Dow Jones Sharia Advisory Board would actually conduct a screening of the component stocks to make sure that they are Sharia compliant. But this would be based on Dow Jones Sharia Board screening methodology. So once the stocks pass the screening by the Dow Jones Sharia Board, they will then choose the 25 largest components and put it into this index that we are tracking. And the index components, in terms of the weightings, are reviewed on a quarterly basis. in terms of the actual component stocks are reviewed on an annual basis, which means once a year, the composition of the index could change. Some stocks could be removed with other stocks replacing it, but the number of components will always be 25. And for us as the manager, we would monitor these changes very closely, as we also would need to rebalance our fund in order to replicate the performance of the index.
And how is your ETF different from the other two?
The other two in Malaysia?
Yeah.
Well, one of the other two actually tracks a conventional stock index, a conventional equity index. So in that sense, one is conventional, ours is Sharia. And the other ETF actually tracks a bond index. So that's a completely different asset class. So that's basically the difference between ours and the other two ETFs that are available on Bursa at the moment.
And if investors wanted to know more about my ETF, how would they be able to find out?
There is a website, www.myetf.com.my. A lot of information available there, including frequently asked questions, the value of the ETF, the latest reports and announcements. So that would be the primary source of information. But they can also contact i-VCAP as the manager of my ETF for more specific information or question that they need answers to.
Okay, thank you so much, Izlan, for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Pleasure.